The TeachPitch podcast. We are very excited to be launching a series of interviews for TeachPitch, a global community of 50,000 subscribers from over 205 countries to date. And for these interviews, we have selected a number of subscribers who have achieved great things. And by great, I mean amazing. Think of former presidents, entrepreneurs, people who've built hospitals, huge non-profit organizations, successful journalists, doctors, etc. And what all our guests have in common is that despite their great success, they've encountered many enormous challenges. So what were these challenges and how did they overcome them? That's what we're going to be talking about here. My name is Aldo de Pap and I'm massively looking forward and very grateful you can join us on this journey. So sit back, relax and download the podcast here.
I think for me, the hardest part was, so we had come from these corporate backgrounds where we could get meetings with people we wanted. If we wanted to meet with somebody, we wanted our phone calls returned, it happened because we had these nice titles. In my case, I was Director of Business Development for Microsoft Greater China. I could usually almost always get the meeting, get the person's attention, make my pitch. All of a sudden, then, I would try to get meetings with major foundations, and either the people either would not take them, or if they did take them, they would spend a lot of time telling me all the reasons that Room to Read wouldn't work. You know, you had kind of those experts talking down to you.
In this interview with John Wood, we talk about how he dealt with the loss of his status and network, changing careers from a senior executive at Microsoft to starting a little-known, cash-strapped charity. We also discuss how he felt challenged while working in the charity sector when trying to bring things to scale, ensuring that millions of people would be helped. And lastly, we talk about how difficult it was bringing the right team together without having any funds. Enjoy this interview with John Wood, founder of Room to Read. A very warm welcome to this next episode of the TeachPitch podcast. And I believe my next guest to be the absolute personification of getting things done. His own personal mantra, GSD, getting shit done, has also become my go-to, especially when I'm stuck in between two half-finished actionable items on my never-ending to-do list. But that as an aside. 22 years ago, John Wood decided to quit his lucrative job as a senior executive at Microsoft in China to ensure that every child would have access to quality education. Or better put, the world starts with educated children. Room to Read's tagline. And to say that John delivered on his idealistic aspiration would be a rude understatement. To date, Room to Read has brought the lifelong gift of education to over 23 million children in over 15 countries. The organization has raised over $600 million since its inception and has delivered impact beyond measure. Just to share a few numbers with you, over 14.3 million children benefited from Room to Read's literacy program. 85,313 cumulative girls registered in the organization's Vital Girls Education program. Room to Read distributed over 26 million books, and the organization manages to train over 15,000 teachers each year. Crazy, very impressive numbers, John. A very warm welcome to you.
Great to be with you.
John, in preparation for this interview, rightly so, you pointed out to me that my intros were slightly too long. So I promise no more intros from my side. But before kicking off, I'm afraid you're going to have to listen to me personally thanking you. And what I would like to specifically thank you for is naturally for starting Room to Read, but more importantly, writing about this process in leaving Microsoft to save the world and building Room to Read. Because these books sincerely ignited something in me that still runs with me today. And specifically leaving Microsoft resonated with myself as a young business graduate in 2007 who wanted to do something to improve this world, but felt that in my direct circles, there weren't too many people sharing these aspirations. And at that time, I'd say it was more difficult to combine a business approach to fulfill purpose. And for a younger me of 14 years ago, to find a book like Leaving Microsoft to Save the World that inspired me above and beyond. So I want to be bold enough to say here that reading your book empowered me to start Teach Pitch back in 2014. So a very big thank you for that. I just want to put out there the effect that your actions and more particularly your writing have had on people like myself.
Well, thank you. That means a lot to me, and it makes all the pain and all the years of writing that book all the more worthwhile when people tell me that it's had an impact on their career and the decisions they've made.
And I hope there are many other crazy people like myself who give you the same compliment. I think the writing was so good in that sense that it really has it has the aspiration, but it also has the directness of how to do it, which was a little bit of roadmap that I was looking for. And I think also the fact that you have a business background, so you approach it from, things like bringing matters to scale, being as effective as possible, measuring impact, all those things. Those are things you're looking for as well when when you look at it with business eyes, I think. And I think because you spoke it in such a manner, but also stayed very true to yourself and someone who likes reading, someone who likes writing, which I think is very obvious when you read your books and, listen back to when you speak about, starting Room to Read, then I think these are two worlds that beautifully come together. So yeah, I think that, and that's really kind of brought together in those two books specifically. But I've learned there's also a Purpose Incorporated, which more particularly speaks about these two things. Is that correct?
Yeah, one of the reasons you mentioned that Room to Read's raised over $650 million US life to date, which is, when I ever hear that number, I'm kind of shocked because our first year, I think we raised about $35,000. So we've come a long way in terms of scaling up the fundraising. And one of the main ways we did this was by reaching out to corporations and reaching out to entrepreneurs to say, we don't want to talk to you about your philanthropy budget because that's usually a pretty limited number and there's usually a lot of different charities competing. Let's talk about how you can build purpose through Room to Read into your overall business plan and your overall dynamic. So working with people, the early employees working for Mark Benioff at Salesforce, for example, Susan DiBianca, Julie Trell, early employees of Salesforce came to us and said, we're talking about this thing we're doing called the Pledge 1%, where 1% of our licenses, 1% of our profits, 1% of employees' time goes to charity. Is there a way that Room to Read and Salesforce can partner together? Which worked out great for us because they wrote us a nice check every year. They gave us Salesforce licenses. Their employees helped to build out our entire database system for Room to Read, which then kept our costs low. And investors really love it when a charity says, we're keeping our costs low, so more of your money goes to the programs rather than to the admin. And so working with companies like Salesforce, working with Goldman Sachs, with Credit Suisse, at the time, an unknown Australian company, Atlassian, which has now become a worldwide force in the field that they're in software, we were able to really, as an organization, as an NGO, combine the best of our world, which is education, with the best of the business world, which is to say, if you want your employees to be motivated, if you want to be able to recruit young people and win the war for talent, you have to be able to prove your company is doing something to make the world a better place.
And I'm so happy that Room to Read in a way could also be, that specific avenue for many of these corporations. And I assume now it's a lot more mainstream for companies to do such a thing, but that's also been a fight, is it not? Has it not been that? Yeah.
It's gotten more mainstream. The question I always have with companies when they talk about doing good for the world is, where's your data? What are your impact measurements? Can you prove you're doing good for the world? Because it's easy for a company to say, oh, we're a good global citizen. We want to help save the planet. We want to lower CO2, et cetera. All good goals. But the question I always say is, okay, where's your data? Yeah. And there's some fun examples in my book. The book that you're referring to is titled Purpose Incorporated, Turning Cause into Your Competitive Advantage. Some of the interviews I did were really interesting. So for example, not a lot of people say good things about Goldman Sachs. People tend to sometimes make assumptions about, well, they're a big bank and you can easily find negative things. But what I found interesting about Goldman was that in the aftermath of the financial crisis, their CEO, Lloyd Blankfein, told all the senior leaders, it was 400 to 500 of them, that 10% of their annual compensation would be ring-fenced and put into what's called a donor-advised fund, e.g., you don't have a choice. Mm-hmm. 10% of your salary and bonus goes directly into something called Goldman Sachs Gives. And that money has to be given away to worthy causes, whether it be Charity Water or Teach for All or Teach for America or Room to Read, you name it. All these organizations then started getting really, really large checks because of just that one decision. And so what I like seeing with companies is when the leadership is daring enough and visionary enough and bold enough to set these KPIs around making the world a better place and then say, we're going to act on it, we're going to report on it, we're going to hold ourselves accountable.
That's great. And I didn't know this about Goldman Sachs. So that's, a new lesson learned for me. And, I hope people, other companies can follow suit. But before we get into your challenges, because now you've raised an interesting topic, because, we need to say, of course, and what the world looks like today. Have you seen any changes in corporate giving since the pandemic hit?
Not really. I think that everybody's so confused by this crazy world we've lived in for the last 15, 16, 17 months. There are some minor changes here and there, but they're too small and it's too early in the game to declare those to be long-term trends. What I do see happening, which is exclusive of the pandemic, it was taking place prior to the pandemic, and it will continue even after people are not wearing masks and the world is hopefully fully vaccinated. And that is that companies are realizing that if they want to win the war for talent and attract the best and the brightest, they're going to have to prove that their company is here on this earth to do good for the world. And what I think is interesting and hopeful about this phase of capitalism is that younger people are saying, I'm not going to go to work for a company if I don't believe in them. The best engineers, the most motivated engineers right now are not going to work for ExxonMobil, which has spent a lot of time and many millions of dollars denying climate change. They're going to work for Elon Musk, either at SpaceX or at Tesla. The best, most motivated, the brightest are going to companies that have purpose at heart.
Yeah, that's really a shift. I mean, to me, maybe for my generation, it sounds very obvious because you look at the company from a holistic perspective. So you don't only look at kind of, what kind of money can I make, but what is the footprint that the company leaves in the world? And if there's anything wrong with that footprint, you're not going to go ahead and work for that company. Or at least that company will have a big problem in recruitment of future talent. So yeah, that's a well-described phenomenon. Let's go to your specific challenges. So as the listeners are aware, we discuss with all our guests kind of the challenges that people needed to overcome to basically, get where they are today. You founded an organization, as you mentioned before, that raised over $600 million, had impact on 23 million people, and is continuing to have an impact. So it's such a massive organization. And, when you submitted the challenges, you basically said, well, that's not where we started, not at all. And as your first challenge, you said that when you started Room to Read, you needed to deal with the loss of status and the loss of your network. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Certainly. I think for me, the hardest part, and it probably is true for my co-founders too. For example, my co-founder, Aaron, was ex-Goldman, ex-Unilever. And so we had come from these corporate backgrounds where we could get meetings with people we wanted. If we wanted to meet with somebody, we wanted our phone calls returned, it happened because we had these nice titles. In my case, I was director of business development for Microsoft Greater China. I could usually almost always get the meeting, get the person's attention, make my pitch. All of a sudden, then I was going to cocktail parties and people would say, what do you do? And I was suddenly saying, well, I deliver books on the back of yaks to rural villages in Nepal, in the Himalayas. And people would kind of look at me like, is this guy crazy? What does he mean he delivers books on yaks? And I kind of overplay that for comic effect, but literally people would just look at me, and I would try to get meetings with major foundations, and either the people either would not take them, or if they did take them, they would spend a lot of time telling me all the reasons that Room to Read wouldn't work. You had kind of those experts talking down to you. And so it was very frustrating because at the same time that we had all these villages and communities and teachers in places like Nepal and Vietnam and Cambodia, which is rebuilding in the aftermath of the Khmer Rouge genocide, we had hundreds of villages asking us for help, but we didn't have hundreds of investors or donors willing to actually fund. So the demand for our services that Room to Read did was very, very high. We want your help building schools. We want your help opening libraries. We want your help getting our daughters enrolled so they can be the first generation to finish secondary school. But we had a complete scarcity of capital to get things done. And so the biggest challenge for us really was, I think for me, was just getting my butt on an airplane and going everywhere I could go. I studied the Financial Times. I studied the UBS and Credit Suisse private wealth reports. That doesn't exactly make me an exciting guy, but I figured out where are the pockets of money? And of course, the pockets of money are in Zurich and London and New York and Sydney and Tokyo. And those are all places that are hard to get to. They're very, very far apart. At the extreme end of wealth, it's distributed really all over the world. There's a lot of rich cities, including I spent a lot of time in Amsterdam, and thankfully my book, Leaving Microsoft, got published in Dutch, and I spoke at the Pink Conference, and I met a whole bunch of people. And so I started to basically just say, I've got to just travel around the world, and if someone can give me a microphone, give me a stage, give me a meeting, I'm going to pitch, and I'm going to pitch from 7 a.m. until midnight. If someone's listening, I'm telling them who we are, what we do, and why they should support us.
Have you ever stopped pitching?
Never.
You're still going.
You can't. I mean, I would wake up in the morning and I'd make a list. Who are 10 people I can call today or email today and ask for a check? And that check might be $1,000 or it might be $20,000. Doesn't really matter. I'm not going to get hung up on the size of the check. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to basically make sure that 10, 15, 20 times a day, I'm asking somebody, will you help to fund a young girl's dreams and get her into the Room to Read Girls Scholarship Program? It's only $300 per girl per year. Or will you fund a library in a rural school in Cambodia? Maybe you do it in honor of your grandmother's 80th birthday coming up, and we put a plaque up to celebrate her. But yeah, always pitching, always selling. And I'm not selling to benefit myself. I am pitching because every day we lose is a day we don't get back. Mm-hmm. Every day a kid does not go to school is an opportunity denied, an opportunity lost. Mm-hmm. And as you and I both know from our conversations earlier, there's still 700 million people in the world today who can't read or write. Over 150 million kids wake up every morning and don't go to school. And 2/3 of those who are out of school and 2/3 of those who are illiterate are girls and women. And we know, all of us who live in developed societies know that when you change the course of the future for women, you change the course of the future for her entire family, for her grandchildren. It all starts with an educated woman. So Room to Read, while we're not anti-boy, as a former boy myself, I would never want to be accused of being anti-boy. We're pro-boy, but we're pro-girl. You have to make sure you don't leave the young women behind.
And the effective cost, because I watched previous interviews with you. You in a previous interview with Google, you said it's $250 for a girl per year. Is that correct? That interview, which was an awesome interview. People can find that on YouTube. Susan Wojcicki, the CEO of YouTube, who's also now, thankfully, a long-term Room to Read board member because she accepted my incessant pitching to get involved. But that interview was about 10 years ago. So adjusted for inflation, it's now $300 per girl per year. $300 per girl per year.
And going back all to what you said about purpose, I'll tell you a quick story around how we can tie these things together. So one of our biggest supporters is a skincare company called Tatcha, Tatcha. Tatcha 10 years ago was a startup in San Francisco, co-funded by two HBS classmates, Vicky Tsai and Brad Murray. They worked with our team, especially a brilliant team member named Sarah Levine at Room to Read, and they came up with an idea called Beautiful Faces, Beautiful Futures. And the idea behind this was beautiful faces is the promise to the consumer. Use our products and you'll have a much more beautiful face. Beautiful futures is every time we sell one SKU, we will donate 83 cents to Room to Read. 83 cents is the cost to put one girl in school for one day. So if you buy 3 products, you're going to support 3 girl days of schooling. Buy 5 products over the course of a year, you support 5 girl days of schooling. It sounds small, and it started small, but it gained momentum quickly. Customers loved it. Social media loved it to say, wow, I'm going to be able to take care of myself while taking care of young women around the world. In life to date, Tatcha has now funded over 4 million girl days of schooling from one thing they put in their corporate strategy. And they said, this is not just the month of November. This is not certain SKUs. They said it's every SKU, every channel, every day in perpetuity. And wow, what an amazing thing for them. What an amazing thing for Room to Read. And the company's done extremely well.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I like the way that Tatcha brought transparency into the equation, because that's often something you do not see as a donor, that you basically, you don't know where your money goes. So if you can make it as simple that you say, well, this 83 cents is going to go to a day worth of education, then, it adds up nicely. It scales up nicely. So,
it scales up really nicely. And we've even had, there's a a couple of guys who started a company called Conscious Step, a sock company. And what they did was every time they sold a pair of socks, they donated $2 to Room to Read. $1 represented the cost to print one local language children's book. So they said, literally, every time you put our pair of socks on, think to yourself, that is literally 2 books we'd be able to print for kids in low-income countries through Room to Read.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's great stories. Thanks so much for sharing that, John. I'm going to go to your next challenge, and I also have some critical questions there. Because you mentioned the challenge of scale, and in kind of describing the challenge, you basically said, I did not want to leave my job, set up a charity organization, and then not having a proper impact. So you said, well, I'm really going to attack this number of 770 million people that lack basic literacy, and I really want to go out there and make a difference. Yet you did not see that really resonated within the charity world that you entered.
Well, when I did my research, because I'm very, very data-driven, I realized at the time that I did my research in the early 2000s, I believe there were 1.2 million registered charities in the United States, 1.2 million just in the US alone. And 90% of them operated on budgets of less than $250,000 a year. And to me, that just seemed kind of like odd because, yes, it's great you're doing good for the world. God bless you. But if you're going to do good for the world, I just think you need to find a way to do it potentially at scale. And so what we said from the beginning, the founding team and I made the goal, and Aaron and Dinesh, my co-founders, and I just put our hands on our heart and said, we're going to reach 10 million children by the year 2020. And we don't know how we're going to do that, but that's our North Star. That is our true north. We want to reach 10 million kids by 2020. So we set milestones that prove that we were making our way towards that goal of 10 million. I'm not the kind of guy who likes to set goals and then publicly fail at them. Maybe there's a little bit of ego involved there. I think it's probably a little bit of that. I think it's mostly just not wanting to let these kids down, not wanting to let the parents down. And so when we approach major companies, whether it be Credit Suisse or whether it be partners like Caterpillar, we just said, hey, unapologetically, we're going to ask you guys to really stretch. We're going to ask you to really help us to think big about this. And we want to build a coalition. We want to build an elite sports team of business executives from around the world. And so whether it be a Dutch online platform company, whether it be a British telco, whether it be a Japanese bookstore, we want to have all these companies get involved with us and help us to scale. Now, what I can tell you is that we actually reached our 10 millionth student 5 years early. And that, while I'm the guy telling you this story right now, it's really important for me to always remind myself that it's not about I. It's about we. We did that collectively. I am one piece of a really, really awesome team called Room to Read. And we are proud to reach our 10 millionth student, 5 years early. We actually reached our 20 millionth student during 2020. So we basically doubled what was already a big, hairy, audacious goal. So super proud of that. But I've always said to myself, stay humble, stay hungry. Remind yourself that that's a nice number, but let's think about the next million kids. Let's think about the next one village we can help and never be satisfied. Just keep pushing until every single kid has that same opportunity that your 2-year-old and my 1-year-old are going to have to go to school every day and have it be a high quality school. Yeah.
Again, the actual number you're attacking is 770 million people that lack basic literacy. As you say, like stay hungry, then there's enough to work with because there's still so many people who are deprived of having access to quality education. There's still plenty to do, even though you're doing an awesome job. I wouldn't want to diminish that.
I'll give a shout out to our third generation CEO, Geeta Murali, and her leadership team, because I was our first generation CEO. My co-founder, Aaron, was our second generation CEO. And when Geeta became the CEO about 3.5 years ago, she actually set bigger goals than Aaron and I had ever set. And she said, I think we can actually go bigger with our impact. And boy, as a co-founder, that makes you feel really good when your third generation CEO is basically, she didn't say you guys are not thinking big enough, but she said, I think there's a way we can think even bigger. And so that really remains the heart and soul of Room to Read, of stay hungry, stay humble, keep setting big goals, and work tirelessly towards those goals.
And have you ever noticed the downside to kind of wanting it to scale? Could you give us some examples?
There's no doubt in my mind that I probably at times pushed people a little too hard. Not everybody had the same desire I had to work extreme hours, to work on Sundays, to always be on airplanes, to look at, I typically looked at the weekend as the opportunity to fly from continent A to continent B because businesses were closed. So if I was in the air, I was at least being productive on the weekend. So I don't think that work ethic and that schedule works for everybody. I think one of the downsides of being relentless about scale is that I probably at some point scared off certain investors because they were just happy that they'd written one check. And I was probably already thinking about, well, gosh, how can I get them to write a second check 6 months from now or a year from now? And so I have no doubt that being bold sometimes doesn't work for everybody in my network. Doesn't work for everybody that I encounter. The question for me is always, does it work with enough people? So if somebody doesn't want to do what I've asked them to do, can we at least shake hands amiably and depart as friends? I think I should either give you a quick yes or a quick no. The worst thing I can do is give you a really slow response that takes weeks and weeks and weeks.
That's well put. Another thing, just to stay on the scale, that what we've seen working, of course, in training teachers is that sometimes the problem of trying to, find a solution for a problem that at first seems educational isn't always educational. There's work that needs to be done alongside governments. There is some, training that needs to be provided to other stakeholders, parents, not in the least, to demonstrate that, it is good, to work together. So sometimes the scale might go, at the expense of the quality, or is at risk of doing that. Have you ever been in such a situation whereby you say, well, now we can get great scalable numbers here, but are we really finding a solution for the problem here? Has that ever been a situation?
Yeah. Oh, certainly. I think any organization that grows quickly is always going to run into finding out they did certain things wrong because they were moving so fast. So one of our earliest employees, Emily Lays, used to say, if we construct a library and 300 children walk by that library on the way to school and they walk by the library on the way home from school and never actually step into it, we've not achieved anything. Or if they walk into the library and the library is badly run or it doesn't have books at the age appropriate level. So we made it a decision early on to make sure we measured our impact, that we would have not just quantity metrics, but quality metrics. And this is something where I really have to thank Melinda Gates. Melinda had actually been my first boss at Microsoft when I joined in 1991. And then later, as Room to Read grew and the Gates Foundation grew, she reached out to me and invited me to lunch. And she said, I don't want to give you $1 to build schools or open libraries or fund girls. And I said, oh, no, why not? And she said, I'll give you money, but the money has to be used to measure your impact. Because if you can't prove to your donors you have quality metrics, then people are not going to support you over the long term. And it was a great piece of advice, and it came with a 5-year commitment to help us to build out a department of research, monitoring, and evaluation. The whole idea being, and again, in the words of I learned from Microsoft, from Steve Ballmer, what gets measured gets done. So we challenged ourselves to say, let's look at reading speeds. How quickly can kids read in our libraries versus the schools where we don't have our libraries? What are the comprehension levels? Because it doesn't really help to read quickly if you don't comprehend what you're reading. What percentage of our teachers have gone through Room to Read training with the Room to Read local teams? What percentage of our girls managed to pass from one grade to the next? And for the girls who had to drop out, let's go measure all the reasons. Let's go interview them and ask them, why did you have to drop out of school? Was it teen pregnancy? Was it early marriage? Was it financial reasons? Was it that your family had to move because they're economic migrants? So measure, measure, measure. And people who are educators, if they are interested in more, roomtoread.org is a really data-rich source where we publish our evaluations, we publish our data, and we hope that other organizations can learn from that because everybody wants to do good for the world. But quite often people scratch their head and say, I'm not quite sure exactly how to measure it. So we've tried to make that a really big focus.
Wow, yeah, that's a very good point. I also wanted to add to that, John, that you have a certain model for communities you help. They need to buy into wanting to be helped and also kind of, work with you to make that happen. Is that correct? Sorry, I forgot the name of the model. I think you have a complete name for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I don't know what we call it these days because when you're the founder, you make a lot of things up. And so originally we called it the challenge grant.
Oh, yeah, that was the one. Yeah.
The idea of the challenge grant was actually my co-founder, Dinesh Shrestha, who's from Nepal, a Nepalese citizen. He came up with this idea. He said to me, John, I'm really tired of people coming to my country and treating the Nepalese people as passive aid recipients. And I said, what does that mean? He said, well, people will come in and they'll say, we're going to come in. We got 20 people coming in from Switzerland, and we're going to spend 2 weeks in your town. We're going to build a bridge for you. We're going to have a bunch of people from America come over and say, we want to build a school. And they're picking up hammers and nails and they're building a school. And then they disappear. And then the local people are kind of like, haven't really bought into the project, haven't been asked to contribute to it. So what Dinesh said early in Nepal is to say, let's require not just the community to donate. Quite often the community, what they can donate is labor, because quite often they're very, very poor themselves, so they don't have money, but they can donate labor, whether it's digging a foundation for the building or painting the walls or building the bookshelves. And then Dinesh required the local government and the national government to actually provide some funding and to agree to pay for the teachers and the librarians' salaries. Mm-hmm. So we worked with the governments, and this was a bit complicated, and I have to give credit to our strong local teams who were able to negotiate this. But in every country we work in, we have a relationship with the government where we say, we're going to help you as much as we can. But when it comes time to put teachers in the classroom, when it comes time to put librarians in the library, they have to be on the government payroll. They have to be on the Ministry of Education payroll. And our local teams have managed to open libraries in more than 40,000 schools, 40,000 schools. And that's all been done under this agreement of let's all pitch in. The local community pitches in, the governments pitch in, our investors pitch in. And our investors love that because we say, look, you might be writing a check to help fund the construction or to help fund the implementation of a literacy program in a school. But guess what? The community and the governments are co-investing alongside you.
Yeah. And that's 100%. That's the best way to make sure that the local community has skin in the game, right? They need to want it and see it happen as well, because they can't just rely on, people from abroad coming in and out.
Yeah. One of our first country directors for South Africa, Chris Matupi, used to go to communities in rural South Africa, and he would say, there are two kinds of help, self-help and help from others. Yeah. And he said, you don't deserve the help from others unless you prove that you believe in self-help enough. Yeah. And I love that. And I think one of the things I'm most blessed by for this last 20 plus year journey with Room to Read is just the more I travel and talk to people, the more I learn. So whether it be Chris in South Africa, whether it be our country director, Shivanti in Sri Lanka, whether it be like really smart philanthropists like Melinda Gates, it's been a learning journey for me. And it's a little bit ironic because a lot of the stuff that's gotten invented at Room to Read's not been invented by me, but because I'm such an active spokesperson, people tend to give me a lot of the credit. And they tend to think that like I thought of a lot of these things. So I'm trying to get really good at making sure that I really give the proper attribution to others, because changing the world is a team sport. And if you're just one guy sitting there with a dream and a blank whiteboard, you're just one guy with a blank whiteboard. When you're out recruiting really talented people, local teams, volunteers, that's the only way you're really going to scale and have an impact. Mm-hmm.
And I'm very happy you say that. Again, I fully agree with you that, you're only as good as your team, or the output of what you do is only as good as, the effort that people who work alongside you put in. But that was a challenge in the beginning, right? Because that's the third challenge that you mentioned, that you were massively ambitious. You said 10 million students to reach them by 2020. You wanted to be operating in at least 10 countries. And you write down, these are lovely ambitions, but you can't really do that if you don't have a big or good team. And when you're an NGO living on public donations, it's not really possible to hire lots of people and get them going. So how did you solve this in the very beginning when you didn't have any funding or when you didn't have any impact or, any of the great things you previously described?
I think a big way we did it was by recruiting a lot of volunteers. And we didn't recruit volunteers to go work in the schools, because I don't know about you, but I would not want my child's education to be dependent upon a short-term person coming in from overseas who doesn't even speak the same language as my child. Mm-hmm. When I talk about volunteers, I'm talking about fundraising volunteers. So we basically, from Vancouver to Boston to London to Tokyo to Hong Kong to Sydney to Singapore, we recruited literally hundreds of white-collar, eventually it was in the thousands, white-collar professionals, people like you, Aldo, And many times I said to them, you don't have to quit your job like I did to change the world. Keep your job at UBS, keep your job at Salesforce, but volunteer your time for Room to Read. Do fundraising events, do galas, do auctions, do pub nights, do quiz nights. Find a way to help us to raise the money. So our job is to go hire really smart local people in places like Vietnam, Nepal, Cambodia, who work for much lower salaries than an expat would work. So we kept our cost of labor low and we kept our effectiveness high by saying we're not going to send Americans abroad to go tell the local people what to do. We're going to hire locally, but then we're going to connect that up to a network of people who live in the wealthiest cities in the world, who will throw events that'll help us to raise millions of dollars. Mm-hmm. And that was just a model that was really incubated in a small number of cities. It started in Chicago, New York, Vancouver, London, and then very quickly grew into a network of over 40 cities where people would carry Room to Read business cards and say that Room to Read is not my job, but Room to Read is my passion. And collectively, that group of volunteers has raised well over $100 million for us.
But still, that starts with having a good network. You make it sound very easy. That's what I'm trying to say. I don't think it is that easy, but you managed it, right?
Yeah. No, I think one thing we did, we had a wonderful volunteer named Melissa Walia who came in and said, John, Aaron, I'm going to get you guys in the press. And I'll work 3 days a week for paying clients. I'll work 2 days a week for you guys for free. And then she got us, stories in CNET. We got an amazing story in Fast Company early on. And one of the highlights of my life was when one of my heroes and one of my favorite writers, Seth Godin, sent us a check and said, build me a couple of schools. I read your story. I love what you do. And next time you're in New York, let's get together and we'll riff on some ideas. And then I eventually got on Charlie Rose, which is a really popular show in the U.S. We eventually got on Oprah Winfrey's show. Yeah. So we used, I think, a combination of really smart, judicious public relations, getting the story planted in whether it's the New York Times or CNN or CNBC, so that we're reaching our intended audience of business leaders who have the ability to help us by writing large checks or getting their companies involved. And then on top of that, we were flying around the world. And whether it would be a Forbes CEO conference or a Barclays conference in Singapore or the Forbes conference in Copenhagen, I just asked all these business leaders, please give me 10 minutes on stage. Let me tell the story. And then even if only 3 people in the audience out of that audience of 300 get excited, then we got 3 more people on the Room to Read team. Mm-hmm. So we called them AAAs, already assembled audiences. We went to companies and said, just tell us, when do you get your employees together? When do you do your annual pep rally? When do you do your annual customer conference? Can we just have 10 or 15 minutes there to tell our story? It'll make you look good because you, Barclays, or you, Goldman Sachs, have given a stage to an up-and-coming NGO. And guess what? It will help us out a lot. And I think for us, we always try to search for those win-wins to say, how can we do this in a way that's beneficial to the company, but most importantly, beneficial to the kids Room to Read serves and hopes to serve?
Again, a great, amazing testimony to all the work you're doing and continuing to do. I have a personal question, if that's okay.
Of course.
You recently became a father. And yes. Has that changed in any way, kind of the way you look at things, the way, of what you've done and as to what you're going to do in the future?
Look, I'd like to be one of these new fathers who says that my life absolutely changed the day little Orion, named after the constellation, was born. But honestly, although I just think for my wife, Amy, and I, our core values are our core values. And those core values are the same today as they were 11 years ago when we started dating, as they were 7 years ago when we got married. We're super committed to education for all of the world's children. I love reading books. Our son just turned 1 year old. I love reading books with him. But I just want every kid everywhere in the world to have what our son Orion is going to have. A great school, dedicated teachers, a print-rich environment full of books with colorful pages and crazy characters and all kinds of fun stories. That to me has been my true north for over 20 years, and it will remain my true north.
Wow, yeah. So if anything, it became even stronger, that sentiment. Is that safe to say?
I think it became a bit stronger, but look, it was already so strong.
So strong. Yeah. If that was even possible.
A lot of delta to move upwards. It's always been. It is my raison d'etre. It's why I wake up in the morning.
Wow. And what would you say to young people, so the young John Woods of this world who basically want to build an organization as big as Room to Read? Which advice would you give them?
Well, the first piece of advice I always give people is don't necessarily think you need to start something, right? We live in this world where people are always like, I'm going to go start, and I can't tell you the number of people I've met who told me they're going to start a new NGO. And I'd say, okay, let me back up there for a minute. So you want to do what? Well, I want to go build orphanages in Haiti. And I'd be like, well, aren't there good organizations in Haiti you can partner with? Well, I don't know. I'd say, well, you need to go figure that out. So if you care, for example, about, let's just say healthcare is your passion. The first thing I would do is go talk to Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, go talk to Partners in Health, figure out, are there organizations out there doing great things where maybe their vehicle is super well designed and their vehicle's in third gear, and you can help to get their vehicle in the fourth gear or fifth gear. Starting something up from scratch is extremely time consuming. It'll take many years to get to the point of it actually scaling. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but the first piece of advice I have is challenge yourself. You have to start something new. There might be a group out there like Room to Read, like Global Citizen Year, like News Story. Those organizations might be able to use you. So if you're passionate about global education, check out Global Citizen Year. Abby Fallick and her team might have a position for you. You're passionate about housing for the poor in places like El Salvador and Haiti and Mexico. Go check out News Story, where Brett Hagler and his team have done a phenomenal job of scaling up. And the quickest path to scale may lie in finding groups that are already doing good work where you can help them do more. Now, however, I'm going to finish just quickly. I'll land the airplane here quickly, although I promise.
No worries.
If people listen to that advice and say, yeah, that's good, but I'm like you, John. I couldn't find the fit. So like you co-founded Room to Read, I have to go start something. My advice would be, it's going to take a while. Don't get frustrated. Stay in that GSD, that get shit done mindset. Wake up every day hungry and humble. But no, you're going to have to put in a lot of hours. No, you're going to have inevitable setbacks, and you can't get frustrated. I also would say find good mentors. And when I say mentor, I don't mean someone who agrees to 1 hour a month and it's a pre-scheduled thing. That busy people typically don't really have time for that. What you want is those 2 or 3 or 4 people in your network that when you have a problem and you email them or text them and say, can I call you? I got an issue. They say, of course you can call me. Or they just hit reply and they call you back immediately and say, what's up? Yeah. How can I help? You need those kind of people in your life. You don't need a lot of them, but you need 3 or 4 or 5 of them that when something just goes wrong, you don't yell at anybody. One of my mentors, who's a former Goldman partner, again, Munir Sadr, used to say, if someone annoys you, don't tell them that they annoy you. Don't tell them you're disappointed in them. Call me and use me as your sounding board. Use me as the guy that you complain to. Mm-hmm. And don't break off relationships because somebody disappointed you. So I think having mentors and having those people you can call on short notice and they can give you a little bit of perspective and help you cool your heels is something every entrepreneur should do.
Yeah, and I want to vouch for that, to properly do your research. But also when you start something yourself, know that it's a marathon, not a sprint. And, with Teach Pitch, we've been going for 7 years now, and I'm happy we're getting it to results. And, we're on a level where we want it to be, but it took us, 7 years, and every single day it's a journey. And I like what you said about waking up every day hungry and humble, because that's exactly what it is. It's, just every day it's starting again, and you have many ups, but even more downs in trying to get it off the ground. So thank you for that wisdom, John. I'm going to close off with 2 questions that I ask all my guests. The first question is, what are you reading right now? And while I say that, I also want to give a shout out to your website, which is johnjwood.com, where you do a lot of reading recommendations.
What I'm currently reading is a book called $1 Billion Loser, and it is a history of WeWork. If people know the company WeWork, that was kind of built on a lot of fluff, and there was a lot of promises made, and the company eventually imploded. Kind of an Icarus tale, right? Someone flies a bit too close to the sun and the wax in their wings melt and they come plunging down to earth. And Adam Neumann, of course, was the co-founder of WeWork and became the public face for it and had a very, what the book describes as being one of the most embarrassing attempts to IPO a company in the history of capitalism. And so it's an interesting book because you know that there's going to be a train wreck, but you're still really eager to read about the preamble to the train wreck. And it's just a great business saga. So that's what I'm currently reading. A book I recommend highly for anybody who wants to be inspired in their efforts to make the world a better place would be Mountains Beyond Mountains. This is a book written by Tracy Kidder about the early years of Partners in Health. And it opens up with Paul Farmer, who is the co-founder of Partners in Health, a super smart guy, one of my personal heroes, who's at medical school at Harvard, but he's spending time in Haiti. And he can't reconcile the fact that this island, 100 or so miles off the coast of the richest country, one of the richest countries in the world, has a healthcare system that's one of the worst in the world. And so he co-founds Partners in Health, gets this thing off the ground. Mountains Beyond Mountains is actually from a Haitian proverb, which is beyond mountains, there are mountains. And that's something that, although you can appreciate as an entrepreneur, that I can appreciate as a social entrepreneur, there's always more mountains to climb. You get to the top of one and you realize there's more. But Mountains Beyond Mountains is just a wonderful book. It's all about changing the world and doing it in a sincere way with dedication and passion. Another one that I loved was called The Last Hunger Season. And this is written, I can't remember the name of the reporter. I believe he's a Wall Street Journal reporter, profiling the formation of a group working in East Africa called 1 Acre Fund. Primarily the founder, Andrew Young. I was a board member. I actually mentored Andrew when he was a Kellogg student, debating whether to go into consulting or to actually follow his passion to do microfinance for farmers in East Africa. The Last Hunger Season, I won't give it away. It's just a wonderful story of a small band of really dedicated people who said, we can do massive change in places in East Africa so that farmers don't have malnourished kids and farmers actually make a decent income through a very smart approach to microfinance. So anyway, lots of reading. And as you said, although every year I publish my top 10 list, I probably read 50 to 60 books a year. And my website at johnjwood.com actually lists my top 10 books each and every year back to about 2014, I think. So people looking for some inspiring reading, please check that out. And if you have comments, please, there's a comment feature. I love to hear from people around the world and learn what they're reading.
Nice. Thank you so much. So Billion Dollar Loser, you're currently reading. Mountains Beyond Mountains, you would recommend, as well as The Last Hunger Season. And then the very last question, John. No, I'm going to do one more question because you also write. So, and I'm a big fan of your writing. And I've read you are in the process of writing something, or is that fake news?
No, it's not. There's 10,000 or 15,000 words on my hard drive right now that might one day become a book.
Okay.
But it's not far enough along that there's any launch date, or if people ask me what it is, I say it's kind of a book-like thingy right now. And it's just not at the point where it's organized enough that even I can describe it.
Okay. Well, let me know when you have something ready. I'd be happy to read it or proofread it or whatever you need me, because again, leaving Microsoft to save the world, as well as building Room to Read, are amazing. And I have yet to read Purpose Incorporated. Apologies for that. And let alone, of course, the many children's books you've written, right? Because we haven't even gotten to that, but you're also a children's book author. Is that correct?
I am. I wrote a book to help young people understand the work Room to Read does. It's called Zach the Yak with Books on His Back. So Zach travels to different places where kids don't have education. And so Zach's kind of like my doppelganger.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you for talking as well about Zach the Yak. And I think specifically for people in our community who are listening, I can highly recommend all the books of John, because I think you can get so much out of them. There's so much in there. Very last question, John. If you were to have a podcast and if you were doing these interviews, who would you want to interview? And I can tell you that you were very high on my list to interview. So I'm so happy I achieved that. But now it's your turn. Who would you want to have as your guest?
I probably have mentioned some of the people already in passing. Vicky Tsai and Brad Murray, who co-founded Tatcha, Mike Cannon-Brooks and Scott Farquhar, who co-founded Atlassian, the most successful tech startup in the history of Australia. On the social side, I just think people like Andrew Young at 1 Acre Fund, Paul Farmer at Partners in Health, Wendy Kopp, who started Teach for America and is now taking it worldwide through Teach for All, Abby Fallick at Global Citizen Year, Brett Hagler at News Story. There's just so many great organizations out there. But I just think for young entrepreneurs and young social entrepreneurs, it's super important to give them encouragement. And my wife and I even do this with our investments. Is we have friends starting something up and they're doing a friends and family round. We'll put some money in and say, we might lose all that money. It's not the safest bet, but it's just important that when your friends are doing something that they believe in, that you vote for them and you vote with them and you pitch in to help them get new things off the ground.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. That's a beautiful, warm message that very much fits the John J. Wood that I see. Thank you so much, John, for this interview. Thank you so much for founding Room to Read, and thank you so much for writing these beautiful books that have inspired many crazy people like myself. It's been wonderful having you as a guest, and I wish you nothing but the best in all your further endeavors. And yeah, come back anytime, I'd say. It's been great having you. John J. Wood, thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you liked this episode of the Teach Pitch podcast, then it would mean the absolute world if you could share it with your friends and or give it a short review on your preferred podcast platform. The more you share your ideas about these interviews, the more people will find out about them. So do let us know what you think. We'd be very, very grateful.
Special thanks to Kevin MacLeod for our beautiful theme music, Le Grand Chase. This podcast was produced and edited by Natalie Piles. Project coordination by Inva Cheney.